Welcome back to the most accurate podcast here at 4 for 4 Football. As always, I'm your host, John Daigle, joined today by friend in life, the man himself, doing the rankings and projections behind the scenes for this 6-team bye week, none other than John Paulson. How are you hanging in there?
Hanging in there. Week 13, by another bipocalypse, Bimageddon. A lot of movement in the rankings. A lot of weird people ranked high because of all the buys. But yeah, we're pushing towards the playoffs right now. So some teams really need a win.
Everyone in a position where they might be streaming quarterbacks, defenses, tight ends. We will certainly help them along the way. And we are going to start with this Thursday night matchup between the Seahawks and the Cowboys, with the Cowboys unsurprisingly being 9-point home favorites. Let's start with Seattle's side of the ball, because we talked about it last week before Zach Charbonnet's first start and told everyone to temper their expectations because he was going to be an every down back, but the run out for the next month without Kenneth Walker was not looking pretty whatsoever. And that's exactly what we saw, because since Walker has left the field since week 11, Charbonnet has handled 29 of 32 running back carries and 10 of 12 running back targets. He's getting the usage we want, but this is another spot, at least for myself, Paulson, where I view Charbonnet as a fringe RB1, touch-based RB2, simply because it's not a great game script or opponent.
Right. I have him ranked as an RB2 this week. He got the usage that we wanted and expected. 18 touches last week. DJ Dallas only had 3. So he is the lead back bell cow. But as you mentioned, this matchup's not great. It's not terrible either. The Cowboys do have a very good defense, but against running backs, they're 16th in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So there's a chance that he could have a nice game here. But it might have to come by the passing game because they might be trailing for most of the game. If he can rack up some catches, then he could certainly post good numbers.
How are you parsing Seattle's wide receivers for everyone a week after Pete Carroll came out after the Thanksgiving game and said he really wants to emphasize particular players and mention specifically Jackson Smith-Njigba moving forward?
Yeah, we're going to maybe see him featured a bit more. I mean, I've got them all ranked in the top 40. This is another tough matchup, though, against the Dallas secondary. It would have to be probably volume-based to really get there in terms of wide receiver 1 numbers for any of these guys. So I've got Metcalf ranked as a wide receiver 2 and Lockett as a wide receiver 3 and Jackson Smith-Njigba until I really see him overtake one of these guys in targets. And it would probably be Lockett that would be taking a back seat to Smith-Njigba. Until I see it on the field, then I'm probably going to continue to rank Tyler Lockett ahead of JSN.
For the Cowboys, it's a similarly tough matchup through the air because we know you don't want to attack their boundary corners in Tariq Woolen and Devin Witherspoon. And that's where Brandon Cooks, who I do think will be a vital piece of playoff rosters in the fantasy postseason, lines up for a majority of his snaps, whereas we don't worry about CeeDee Lamb in any matchup. And that really leads me to Tony Pollard here, because we have tempered our expectations for Pollard. Everyone now high fives one another when he reaches 80 yards and a touchdown. Completely fine. But we know since week 9, Seattle has crumbled against running backs, collectively allowing 106 yards per game, 5.7 yards per carry, and 6 rushing touchdowns in that span. So I do think we are looking at a blow-up game for Tony Pollard relative to however much he can blow up nowadays.
Yeah, I've got him ranked in the top 10, top 8 or so. As you mentioned, he's kind of picking it up here the last couple of weeks. The Seahawks allowing 5.7 yards per carry to running backs since week 9, 1.5 touchdowns per game, 127 yards rushing to opposing running backs, along with 52 yards receiving to opposing running backs since week 9. So it's all over the place that they're giving up points to running backs. So this looks like a really good spot for Tony Pollard.
I may have parlayed Pollard over 63.5 rushing yards and over 20.5 receiving yards ahead of this evening. Moving on to Sunday and the Dolphins and the Commanders. The Dolphins, who are unsurprisingly 9.5-point road favorites. It's the cleanest spot possible for Tua and this passing offense. because the Commanders over the last month, since they traded Montez Sweat and Chase Young, dead last in the league in pressure rate. And Tua from a clean pocket has only completed just 76% of his passes for a league-high 20 touchdowns. And here comes Tyreek Hill, who probably can reach 200 receiving yards in this game too. So to me, it's a start all the dudes game for the Dolphins offense.
Yeah, let's just run down the gauntlet of quarterbacks that the Commanders have given up huge games to. Mac Jones, not that huge of a game, but 220 and a touchdown. Geno Smith,
huge for Mac Jones.
Yeah, huge for Mac Jones. That's probably maybe his best game of the year. Geno Smith, 369 and 2 touchdowns. Tommy DeVito, 246 and 3 touchdowns. You actually called that as he's a good streamer. And Dak Prescott, 331 and 4 touchdowns last week. Obviously, he's playing very, very well. So on an average since week 9, 291 yards, 292 yards passing, 2.5 touchdowns per game. So this is a fantastic spot for Tua.
If you are desperate, I don't mind sneaking Jeff Wilson in as well, because we saw Wilson pop up against the Jets on Friday for a season-high share of running back carries, 33% and double-digit touches, not to mention a 10.7% target share. So I think Wilson, regardless of Devon Achane's health in this game, could be working his way into a 3-headed timeshare. What about you with Achane on the mend?
Yeah, I don't know where I stand with him. I don't feel confident that he's going to play yet. I know he's limited in practice, so until I see a full practice, I'm not, or until we get word that he's expected to play, I'm not going to put him back in the rankings until that happens. Just with these knee injuries, they're tricky, especially a re-injury like this. So I have Mostert ranked quite high. Wilson ranked 29th. This is a good spot for both running backs. The Washington defense is 29th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs as well. So they're bad all over the field. So I think, pretty much all the Dolphin skill players should be startable this week.
For the Commanders punching back, it's just complicated since it's not a cliche. The target tree is expanded. We even saw in Thanksgiving with Antonio Gibson back, Brian Robinson's target share dropped to single digits. So he's getting the carries, but it's not a spot where we'll likely see carries given the projected game script. So I have the most faith in Curtis Samuel personally, not just for recency bias, but because although they're trying to take him off the field, they have no choice but to run 3 wide sets in these blowouts. And it's going to be another situation like that. And Samuel, to avoid sacks for Sam Howell, did see 67% of his targets within 9 yards of the line of scrimmage. They're just going to dump it off again to him. So I'm just seeing a high PPR floor for him this week.
Would you rather start Curtis Samuel over Terry McLaurin?
Samuel has the higher floor. But
yeah.
Then we get into that manager-based, how do you operate your team, which is going to be subjective.
I think you look at the Commanders' offense; they're leading the league in pass attempts, and they're probably going to for the rest of the year. So I think they're all sort of volume-based plays, and Miami is, they're a tough matchup for Brian Robinson and company in the running game, but for receivers, they're not bad at all. They're 30th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the receiver position. That's usually, because they're leading games, the Dolphins. So I think this is just looking at this game on the surface, it's going to be a game where the Commanders are going to have to throw the ball, and they want to throw the ball. Like we've seen it week after week after week. The defense can't stop anybody. They have to throw the ball. So just a lot of targets to go around, even though the target tree is a little weird there. They're sometimes featuring their running backs or tight ends. It's, you still pretty good plays amongst this receiving core with McLaurin, Dotson, and Curtis Samuel.
What about Brian Robinson for you? How are you ranking this week?
He's the Dolphins are 4th in just fantasy points allowed to running back, so it's a bad matchup. If Antonio Gibson were out again, then I would feel a lot better about starting him just as a volume-based RB2. But with Gibson back, eating up some snaps, I think they had Chris Rodriguez playing some snaps last week as well, which eats into Robinson's opportunities. I've got him ranked as a low-end RB2 this week.
For the Colts at the Titans, arguably the biggest news in fantasy circles of the week with Jonathan Taylor's thumb surgery, and now we are unclear of his timeline. I've heard reports of 2 to 3 weeks. They have yet to put him on injured reserve, so we won't know until this weekend or perhaps even next week the extent of it. But we do know Zack Moss played in 3 games without Jonathan Taylor earlier this year. And in those 3 games, handled 90% of the team's running back carries, 90% of their touches, and ranked third in the league in 10-yard runs. And now he's going back to being an every touch running back in this great spot.
He's you start him. If you have him, you start him. I think he's, I'm looking at expert consensus ranking around the industry, and he's being ranked too low in my opinion, outside the top 10. I have him at 3. I think, Christian
outside
McCaffrey,
the top 10, really?
Yeah. Alvin Kamara at 2 and Zack Moss at 3. You could maybe make a case for some of these guys, Eckler, Etienne, Pollard over him, but we saw what he did, just earlier this year with Jonathan Taylor out, and I think we're just going to see a huge touch share for him. And the Tennessee rush defense is not what was earlier this season. They're not doing quite as well. They're 21st adjusted fantasy points allowed to running back, so I think he's a great start.
That sounds like people who haven't watched Austin Eckler and Travis Etienne play football this year, as they are living off touchdowns and nothing else. And for the Colts, as you mentioned, the Titans defense just falling apart all over. It's yet again another amazing spot for Michael Pittman and Josh Downs. I know Josh Downs didn't get there in the box score last week, but still to tie Michael Pittman in target share, and now in his last 3 full healthy games to see at least 23% of the team's targets, Josh Downs is certainly, given the Colts schedule over the fantasy playoffs, someone that I'm very high on as well as Pittman in this game and rest of season.
The Titans have yielded an average of 12 catches for 154 yards and a touchdown to opposing receivers, and that includes last week's gauntlet of talent, the Carolina passing game last week. If you remove them, Jonathan Mingo and company, you're looking at 13 catches, 166 yards, 1.33 touchdowns to opposing receivers. Titans have been a pass funnel. I don't know if there's so much of a pass funnel anymore, but they're still bad against the pass. So I think Gardner Minshew and company will do well. And Downs with 13 targets last week, certainly underperformed in terms of his fantasy points per target, but that just means he's likely going to see a big game here soon.
Falcons taking on the Jets in the Abyss Bowl. And although Bijan Robinson's share numbers ultimately came down behind the scenes, he still got there on 2 touchdowns. The schedule is still a great one to have him in the fantasy playoffs. And really it was about how the Falcons just put the Saints away, since all 3 of their running backs averaged over 5 yards per carry in that soft spot. The same one we'll get to soon here for the Lions this week. So overall, what are you doing with this Falcons offense in your rankings?
Well, they're really tough to throw on. They're not hard to run on at all. The Falcons like to run the ball. So I think just 2 + 2 = 4 in this one. And you're going to see a very run-heavy game plan for the Falcons. And Bijan Robinson is an obvious start, but I think even Tyler Algier has some, in a short week when we're missing all these running backs from all these teams that are on bye, I think he's definitely flexible in this matchup. I've got him ranked at 34, but you're looking at some of these guys around him, maybe his touch floor is a little bit higher than theirs, maybe 10 touches this week at least against this Jets defense if the Falcons go as run heavy as I would expect, given the run funnel nature of this Jets defense.
The Falcons are obviously also an elite streaming option against Tim Boyle. Having said that, it's still a safer spot, in my opinion, for Garrett Wilson. Still needs to score a touchdown to get there, like last week, double-digit targets, 44 receiving yards, but eventually got there in a blowout game script, which is what we're expecting here. But at least we're seeing that Tim Boyle still targeting Wilson heavily under center.
Yeah, he's in the same boat as Jamar Chase, Devontae Adams, bad quarterbacking, but the lion's share of the targets, so you can still run him out there, and maybe you're going to get your 7 for 60, and if he gets a touchdown, you have a pretty good day.
Cardinals at the Steelers, and we saw some changes for the Steelers beyond 2 coordinators going over 400 total yards. Stop me if you've never heard that one. And more importantly, moving Pat Freiermuth around, a season high in route rate from the slot. George Pickens' role didn't change whatsoever, and just a comfortable Kenny Pickett, who is my personal favorite streaming option for those who are missing their quarterback this week. Because the Bengals, one of the league's worst defenses, whenever Kenny Pickett was operating from a clean pocket, went 24 of 27 for a league high in completion rate and over 10 yards per attempt. And here comes this Cardinals defense. That's the same thing. Literally dead last in generating pressure. So I think it's as great of spot for Pickett imaginable, who has yet to have a top 12 week in his career. I think it could be that kind of week for him.
That's interesting, and I like it. I mean, I've got him ranked at 16 or 17 in the quarterback rankings. But you're looking at these guys, and we'll talk about my guy Jordan Love a little bit later. But Baker Mayfield at 14, Gardner Minshew at 15, Stafford with Cleveland at 16. Pickett could be started over those guys given the matchup against Arizona and this newfound offensive juggernaut of the Steelers offense. My question is, if they gained all these yards, why they only score 16 points against the Bengals?
That is completely fair. I'm also annoyed that we got the exact usage for Jaylen Warren that we wanted, out touching Najee Harris. But since Najee is still used inside the 10-yard line, it's still going to take the same explosive runs for Warren to score, since none of his touchdowns has come inside the 10. So still a little bit annoying there, but it is a backfield split, and it is an defense where we're pretty much throwing everyone out there against them.
It's almost like Najee saw that pregame report that they were going to start featuring Jaylen Warren and getting Jaylen Warren more touches, because he came out running angry at 6.6 yards per carry. Warren only 3.8.
Yeah, he had a couple explosive runs too. He looked really good, actually. And it's equally as soft of a spot. The Bengals and Cardinals are who we target everyone against. On the other side of the ball, Kyler Murray, I'm actually worried about, because he's been bad through the air, and he's been getting there with 3 consecutive games with a rushing touchdown. So in the fantasy playoffs, where his schedule is absolutely miserable, I just wonder what happens when he doesn't score a rushing touchdown, since that's clearly not sustainable. Since he returned, he's 32nd in completion rate on throws, 10 yards downfield. That's why Greg Dortch continues to get there, because he's being peppered underneath. And now in his last 2 games, Dortch has even out-targeted Rondale Moore 17-4. So I do have a lot more confidence in Greg Dortch than a lot of people around the industry. But overall, I'm still somewhat worried about Kyler here.
Yeah, I think you can be. It's sort of a similar situation to Sam Howell, in that the defense is so bad that I think that's going to keep Kyler Murray throwing the ball enough. And I'm looking at his game log here. He had 7.8 yards per attempt against Atlanta, 7.1 against Houston, and then 5.7 last week against the Rams. Rams are, become a kind of a tougher defense for quarterbacks to face. He will get rushing yards. The touchdowns may not be there, and that might lead to a low scoring game, but I think, or a low scoring fantasy outing for him. But I think against Pittsburgh, he should be okay.
Any thoughts on James Conner and his homecoming here too?
The interesting thing about the revenge game, it's always a factor in terms of that he might see an extra goal line carry or something if the coach decides he wants him to get a score against his old team. The concerning thing, I think, for Conner is that Michael Carter and Imari DiMercado got some touches last week and played some significant snaps, and so we've been kind of leaning on Conner's workload as the reason we would start him, and it's a little bit dicey now if they start to devolve this into a 3-headed backfield.
Lions at the Saints, which are going through injury clusters on both sides of the ball. We talked about obviously playing quarterbacks, Jordan Love included, against the Lions defense last week, since their defense is just so miserable. And the Packers got there. The Saints are not that offense, though. They are probably not that offense at full strength, but when they're also missing Michael Thomas, maybe Chris Olave, who's still in concussion protocol, and Rashid Shaheed, who's dealing with what seems to be a multi-week quad injury, this is not the spot at all. The Lions are 4-point favorites. I think they're going to win by double-digit points and just put this one away between David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. I know Jahmyr Gibbs' usage behind the scenes was much better than Montgomery's, but it was also negative game script following Detroit's multiple turnovers. So it's just a week where you start all of your Lions.
Yeah, all of them except for probably Josh Reynolds and guys like that. But yeah,
I said your Lions. Let's hope that no one's sitting on those. Yeah.
So yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think Derek Carr would, under normal circumstances, be a nice streamer this week if he had Olave and Shaheed healthy, but he doesn't. And Olave is in a situation where 9 times out of 10 or 19 times out of 20, a guy concussed in the previous week doesn't make it back the following week. But it's happened a couple times, and he was actually at practice, I believe, either yesterday or today, which is a good sign, but far from being cleared. Now, if Olave is back, then you can start looking at Carr. I'm going to bump up Carr in the rankings a bit, but because Detroit's 28th in just fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, and it's a good matchup, as you mentioned, for all the quarterbacks. But if he's down as to A.T. Perry as his number one receiver, and Kirkwood or whoever that was, Keith Kirkwood is his number two, and they've got, I think the only couple of plays that are obviously Kamara, like he's probably going to see a 30% target share or something like that. But I think Juwan Johnson is viable as a streamer at tight end. He's bumped up the rankings considerably, and I think Taysom Hill will probably be a very big part of the offense as they try to figure out ways to move the ball without their top receivers. So Carr, not so much, but I think some of these other guys are viable as streamers in a tough week in terms of buys.
I know people want to play A.T. Perry as well. He'll be out there, but just remember he's a 6th-round rookie who last week even had the opportunity at the beginning of the game. He ran the wrong route, and that's what led to Derek Carr's red zone interception. They benched him immediately after. They only put him back on the field whenever Olave and Shaheed went down, and then they were forced to play him too. So I'm not trying to get too cute unless I need to in 14-team leagues. It is very clearly, as you mentioned, Kamara, Taysom Hill, and then Juwan Johnson, who did run around on over 80% of dropbacks last week, also saw 7 targets. They are using him and have no choice but to use him again in this spot.
You could really look at him as their number one receiver this week, Juwan Johnson.
I agree.
If you don't count Kamara. So I think he's, could see like a 20% target share.
I have him behind Pat Freiermuth as my favorite streamer, since Freiermuth's still available in a majority of leagues. Would you agree with that, or would you prefer Johnson?
I do. I have a Freiermuth at 8 and Johnson at 10, but it's pretty close. And those just interesting guys. Freiermuth, we've seen it on I guess a longer sustained basis. We haven't seen it much from Johnson this year, but he has had a couple good games since he came back. So I trust him here in a short week.
Chargers at the Patriots. I don't know why the Chargers are laying 6 points to anyone, even the Patriots, but nonetheless, it's become pretty condensed for Los Angeles because Quentin Johnston just can't get there as he continues to struggle in developmental reps. And there's nowhere else to go but Keenan Allen and Austin Eckler confidently. Anyone else you're trying to sneak in here for the Chargers in this spot?
Maybe Gerald Everett at tight end if you're in a pinch. I think he's decent. They're just desperate for playmakers in the passing game, and nobody has really stepped up. So Gerald Everett did have a decent game, I think, last week. But after that, it's really tough to count on Guyton or Johnston or any of these other guys.
For the Patriots, we don't know the quarterback situation just yet, although I believe it's going to be Bailey Zappi. Without Demario Douglas, who's still in the league's concussion protocol, may miss this game too. We did see, again, for 14-team leagues only, it probably doesn't matter, but Tyquan Thornton was targeted on 5 of 9 passes whenever Demario Douglas got knocked out of the game. So he'll be on my DFS radar, better or worse, at least. And other than that, Ramondre Stevenson is the one who's really finally looked at full strength, although he's still splitting touches. He's looked much healthier these last 3 games.
And he's been a bit more involved in the passing game, and that makes sense given the injury to Demario Douglas. And unlike Chris Olave, Douglas is not at practice as of Thursday, so he's unlikely to play. I don't have him in the rankings. So, you're looking at maybe Devontae Parker, maybe Juju Smith-Schuster popping their heads up, but you have no confidence in most of these guys. Parker, at least when he gets targets, has delivered in the past. Chargers are 27th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the receiver position. So I could see DFS dart throw type of a play, or if you're in a really big league, you're throwing him out there, running him out there as a flex. And if you're just in a pinch, because, he could serve as the number 1 receiver for the Patriots this week with Bailey Zappi at quarterback. And I do agree with you that it's going to be Zappi and not Mac Jones or Cunningham.
The Broncos and Texans game is not only interesting, but has lots of moving pieces. Let's start with the Texans because Tank Dell was spotted at practice on Thursday, and D'Amico Ryans believe he's going to play. On that same note, Dalton Schultz has not practiced. So now we're getting yet again another shuffle here where CJ Stroud doesn't have his full arsenal of weapons. So let's just assume Tank Dell's active and Dalton Schultz is out. How are you handling Texans receivers?
Yeah, and Noah Brown is apparently back at practice and,
Yep.
and looking likely to play. So I put him in the rankings, and he comes in as a wide receiver 4. He really was tearing it up prior to the injury, but Robert Woods is back, so I don't know how much they're going to rotate those two because you assume that Tank Dell and Nico Collins are playing a lot of snaps, and then the fourth spot are kind of being rotated. Noah Brown has been significantly better than Robert Woods, but it doesn't necessarily mean coming off the injury that he's going to step right back into the role that he had. But with Schultz out, I think you just kind of forget about the tight end position. Maybe the backup gets a couple of touches or a couple targets, but really it's going to be, my confidence would be in Dell and Nico Collins for sure. And then I think, the best bet in terms of a dart throw is Noah Brown, just given the way he played prior to the injury.
The Broncos are allowing the most points per game to opposing tight ends. So, like Tucker Kraft last week, I do think it's fine if you're that desperate and you're in one of these larger leagues where Freiermuth, Juwan Johnson aren't even available. I don't think Brevin Jordan is the worst option. I've made dumber decisions than throwing him out there. So, I don't hate that. And for the Texans running backs, it's an amazing spot. Broncos bottom 3 in yards per carry and explosive runs allowed to opposing running backs. And the only one to trust is Devin Singletary, who we saw not only split carries, but also get all of the passing work. Even Dameon Pierce only had 5 routes in that entire game. So Singletary, who had 7 targets, that's the one who we have to lean to until further notice over Pierce.
Yeah, Pierce didn't run better than Singletary or anything like that. It wasn't like he was going to earn a lot more snaps.
Singletary had that 41-yard screen. Looked awesome.
Yeah, 54 yards receiving on 6 catches, 7 targets. So, yes, I think in this matchup especially, you're looking at Singletary as the Broncos are, I think, giving up the most rushing yards per game this year, but the 31st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. It's been a great matchup pretty much all year, and I don't think that Singletary is like a no-brainer because we're not at the point where he's going to necessarily see 18+ touches for sure, like he would with Pierce out. But I think he's a really solid RB2 given the matchup and given his likely workload. I mean, he saw 12 last week. I would think 15 to 18 is a good estimation for him this week.
It's also how the Broncos or how the Texans have to move the ball in this situation, because the Broncos defense isn't a fluke. They're no joke whatsoever. They limited Josh Allen to less than 200 passing yards and 2 picks. Patrick Mahomes in the first game when he didn't have the flu reached 17 fantasy points, but they held the Chiefs to only 8 points. But the Broncos defense is real, and this is Stroud's toughest test since week 1 against Baltimore. He's pretty much been getting by, although been amazing, responded against every test he's had. He has been getting by on an easier schedule. So this is a true litmus test for Stroud in the passing game, which makes me somewhat concerned about actually the production and output of this contest. On the other side of the ball, I think it's a better spot for the Broncos passing game because, yes, they want to slow this thing down and just run Javonte Williams into the ground. But the Texans' pass defense is what's fallen apart, even cutting Shaq Griffin on Wednesday, who had been their best corner to this point of the season. And in their last 4 games, Joe Burrow, Trevor Lawrence, Baker Mayfield all averaged over 8.6 yards per attempt. So if we get a little pushback here, still, again, not sure if we will, I do think Russell Wilson, Courtland Sutton are the beneficiaries here.
Yeah, Sutton ranked as a wide receiver 2. Wilson in the top 12 this week, which is kind of a rarity for him. But the Texans are 31st adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this year, so definitely a great spot for him. And I do kind of think this will be a high-scoring game. Maybe I'm underestimating the Broncos defense a little bit, but they're 18th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. So I think Stroud, with how well the Houston passing game is rolling, will be certainly serviceable as a mid-range QB1. So I think this is, maybe a sneaky shootout, or it just seems like all these Houston games end up being kind of crazy, high-scoring games. So I just feel like, both sides, there's lots of players you could play.
Stroud has passed some tough tests, but this is definitely one I'm worried about. And for the Broncos, anyways, although we are most confident in Cortland Sutton, Javonte, I don't like dropping any of their players, Marvin, Mims, and Jerry Jeudy included, just because so many things can happen. And their schedule for the fantasy playoffs is incredible. Like, not only this week against, as we mentioned, a weak Texans secondary that's getting worse by the week, they have the Chargers, the Lions, the Patriots, the Chargers, and the Raiders to close the year. So if anything were to happen to any of them, and we get a cemented 2-wide set between any of the three, like, you're going to start them every week. So, like we talk about contingency options at running back, the Broncos receivers are also contingency options, just seeing what happens and how their target tree shakes out over the next few games. For the Panthers and the Bucks, Baker Mayfield expected to play this game despite getting injured on the team's first drive, injured on that quarterback sneak from the 1-yard line. And honestly, it's outside of the same guys you continue getting there. Mike Evans, Rachaad White, Chris Godwin to a lesser extent, Cade Otton if you're desperate too, who's just always available on waiver wires. He's always out there, and he's always available if you need to plug in a Band-Aid for bye weeks. There's really nothing else here to discuss, given that the Panthers' offensive coordinator change and so many injuries, just a litter of them on defense this week.
Yeah, I would just note that the Panthers have been a run funnel. So Rachaad White is, I mean, I think everybody who has him is probably starting him, but they're 27th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, and they have improved their rush defense, but not to the degree that it's affecting their pass defense in terms of those numbers. I mean, Mayfield his matchup's bad. Carolina's third in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. It's bad for Mike Evans, but you still start him. They're second in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. So I'm kind of looking at Godwin as like a fringe wide receiver 3 this week. Just isn't seeing the volume that Evans is, obviously. And then Otton, as you mentioned, low end tight end 1, high end tight end 2, just because his role has grown. He's on the field all the time. Maybe he gets there with a touchdown. But it's a weird thing with Carolina because they just offer almost no pushback. So they tend to play in low scoring games and don't really force the opposing team to pass a whole lot.
And that's the issue as well, that the Bucks have been a defense we've been confidently targeting. They've been one of the league's worst defenses out of their bye, but Bryce Young doesn't get there against anyone. So you can run Adam Thielen out there and hope that he also produces. I know we had 3 targets last week, but he had double-digit targets in the 2 games prior. So cross your fingers, but that's about it. It's just a soft spot.
And the one thing with Bryce Young, if you look at the running game for the Panthers, it's dicey. Like, Hubbard had a good game against the Titans last week, but they're second in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running back. So I'm worried that they won't be able to run the ball at all, and that might actually force Bryce Young into even more dropbacks against the soft Bucks secondary. So I don't think he's going to get there to the point where you want to start him, but Thielen might get there just on volume. And if you're just looking at a team that you can't run against, the Bucks are definitely high on that list. So they've been bad against the pass all year. Thielen has a matchup with the Bucks are 29th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. So I have him ranked as a wide receiver 2, but we talked about Thielen earlier in the year, and that he's on this really hot run, and we're like, how long is this going to last for an older player? Is he going to be able to continue to keep up with this sort of volume and this sort of production on a per target basis? And he hasn't. Like, his efficiency has gone way down, but he's still seeing the lion's share of the targets. And they don't have anybody else really to throw to, so he's the only guy.
And for the running backs, yeah, 1, you're not playing them against the Bucks anyhow, but 2, there are enough rumblings coming out under Chris Tabor and Thomas Brown, who's now calling plays for them. I think Raheem Blackshear is going to be involved a lot more than people think. Let's just say that. I think they want to get him going as well. So just be very careful about the Panthers running backs out there. The 49ers and the Eagles, though, a much better game to talk about, because as we discussed with Josh Allen in the passing game, getting Gabe Davis in everywhere, even being confidently streaming Khalil Shakir, whatever we needed to, it's the same spot for the 49ers, because this Eagles miserable passing defense not covering anyone, has now allowed at least 28 fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks in 3 of their last 4 games. And Patrick Mahomes should have joined that group, but 2 touchdowns were dropped in that game too. For Brock Purdy, Debo, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey, it's all just matchup proof. Even Purdy out of his bye these last 3 games, albeit against a softer schedule, is leading the league in completion rate under pressure too. Nothing's going wrong. And now they have extended rest against an Eagles defense that also were on the field for 93 plays in overtime last week against Buffalo on Sunday. Like, it's the cleanest spot possible for San Francisco.
So you would confidently start Purdy over CJ Stroud due to the matchups?
Man, that's a great question, and I think I would. Yeah. Now, I won't say confidently, but I would make the decision. I would do that decision.
I had that question on Twitter, and I was thinking to myself, how hard is it right now to bench CJ Stroud, over a matchup? It's interesting. Yeah. That's a tough one. I agree, though. This is going to should be a pass-heavy attack for the 49ers. If they struggle at all running the ball, which they are likely to, the Eagles are first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, but McCaffrey can get there as a receiver, as we've all seen, and he's also likely to get a rushing touchdown just from the goal line anyway. But yeah, Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, I think they're all startable this week, and no worries about any of them.
For the Eagles and Jalen Hurts, lots of matchup proof options anyways, but we have seen in their 2 games without Dallas Goedert out of the bye, Devonta Smith is carrying a 33% target share, AJ Brown at 25%. I think both players will get there regardless, and it's such a concentrated target tree that no one else is getting there anyhow. But anything of note in your rankings with the Eagles offense, DAndre Swift included?
Yeah, I mean, I've Hurts at 1 overall, and the 49ers are number 1 in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, but I'm just not worried about Jalen Hurts. Yeah. Likely to get a couple tush pushes, and the receivers. The matchups aren't bad for Devonta Smith. They're kind of mediocre for Devonta Smith and AJ Brown. The 49ers are 17th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers, so nothing really to worry about there. I think maybe DAndre Swift is a little bit, you could see him not really scoring a touchdown and maybe not having the greatest day running the ball, but I've got him ranked as an RB2 as well.
For Swift, it's just hard because it's easy to point out regression with running backs, right? Like Tony Pollard was getting the same usage as Travis Etienne and Rachaad White, and Etienne and White were arguably worse in efficiency. They were just scoring touchdowns, and Tony Pollard was not. So it's easy to predict Tony Pollard now scoring his touchdowns the rest of the way. For DAndre Swift, though, although the usage is not changing, we've never seen anything like the tush push in our lives. Like, I don't know how to spot regression whenever the Eagles should keep going back to Jalen Hurts within 2 yards of short down and distance situations because it's the most efficient play in NFL history. Like last year, even, he converted 11 of his carries from the 1 yard line into 8 touchdowns. This year, he's converted 8 of his 10 carries into touchdowns as well from the 1 yard line, which has doubled Gus Edwards for the most from the 1 yard line too. It's just not anything they need to go away from. So I don't know how it gets better for DAndre Swift. He has to score from outside the 5.
Exactly. He's not going to get the touchdown at the 3 or the 2 or the 1. He's going to have to score from the 5 or the 10 yard line, break a run all the way into the end zone. And those are a lot less frequent. I mean, obviously most of our rushing touchdowns come from inside the 5.
Cleveland Browns and Los Angeles Rams. It seems like we are trending in the year 2023 towards a Joe Flacco off the street start. You mentioned the Rams defense, who, by the way, spiked an amazing draft class. Maybe it's because they've had 3 years to work on these picks that didn't have any prior, but between Byron Young, Kobe Durant, who I know a lot of fantasy players don't know, Steve Avila and their offensive line, Puka Nacua, of course, they honestly just nailed it. But it's a great spot to stream their defense because Joe Flacco obviously makes us concerned about everyone. Amari Cooper battling a rib injury as well. So outside of David Njoku, how are you handling this Browns offense?
Yeah, Njoku, solid,
tight
end 1. Yeah, the Rams are 32nd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. I just want to mention that. That's one of the best matchups in the league.
And he's been so much better from everyone but Deshaun Watson. It's like he's
I would think that would consider.
Guy.
I would think that would continue with Flacco. I mean, Flacco's a wild card. I did see a video today that I didn't even realize this, but he was telling his teammates to tackle Deebo Samuel if he broke kickoff return in the Super Bowl. Like he wasn't sure what the penalty was, and was just like, tackle him if he comes along the sideline, if he breaks one. I just thought that was an amazing clip. I'm so happy I saw it today.
Which is pretty smart too, right? Because although morally you would be yelled at, the offense would get the ball back, but it's so unlikely they score from the 30.
Yeah, it would just have caused so many rules changes and chaos, I think. Maybe you get, if you do it, you get banned for a year type punishment. I mean, I would think that would have to, if it decided a Super Bowl. But I love that he was like, I don't know what the punishment is, but just do it. Like he didn't know what it would be, and I just thought it was amazing for the quarterback.
It's a lot like there's a Freakonomics episode that when you're supposed to merge lanes in traffic, there's always that open lane that people cut in front of you by driving all the way up to that lane, and you get upset. But actually, it's most efficient to use that lane. And so they're doing it right. But you just have to put your morals to the side because you're upsetting every call you're passing because they merge early. It's a lot like that, where Joe Flacco was causing chaos and probably going to break the rules, but he was right. Like that was the correct play, honestly, was to stick your foot out and trip somebody.
So I take it from this conversation that you're the type of guy that goes to uses all that open lane. And
no, I'm too soft. I go to therapy. I cry. There's no chance. Right. I want those people looking at me. There's no chance.
But it's the most efficient, is what you're saying.
Yes,
what were we talking about? Joe Flacco.
Oh,
this is tough for Amari Cooper. Maybe a little bit better for him than the other quarterbacks that they have there. I don't know, but. Joe Flacco at one point was a pretty decent fantasy quarterback. I'm not excited about this from the Browns standpoint. They probably should go very, very run heavy, a lot of Jerome Ford and Kareem Hunt. The matchup's sort of mediocre for those guys. I don't know that they're going to be able to move the ball a whole lot that way. So, at some point, Joe Flacco is going to be put to the test and probably fail. But he is #elite. And at one point he was, apparently, and maybe he turns around. I don't have confidence in any of the Browns pass catchers outside of Njoku. I would hate to have to start really a Cooper, Cooper would be my choice, but Elijah Moore, you just don't have a whole lot of confidence in these guys.
And honestly, just given the outlook from Amari Cooper, how he's played with all backup quarterbacks, he's Bizarro David Njoku. You're finding someone in a better matchup. Like, even if, let's say, Noah Brown is healthier, like at least Noah Brown has a better quarterback. And so I'm not doing it confidently, but I'm probably starting him over Amari Cooper. I do not want to play Amari Cooper probably for the rest of the year, honestly, if I don't have to.
And the Rams are 7th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers, so it's also a bad matchup, in addition to bad quarterbacking.
So I would normally say the same thing about Cooper Kupp and Puka. Cooper Kupp, who's not even in the top 40 wide receivers in points per game. It's been miserable. I know everyone wants to sit him. I can't even blame you if you have better options. You probably should sit him, honestly. But if Myles Garrett, Jordan Elliott, Denzel Ward, if these cluster injuries scratch these guys in this game, we know Stafford is still 9th in yards per attempt from a clean pocket. It's the same situation why we wanted to play him last week against the Cardinals and sneak him in there. It's a significantly better spot, and the Browns are not a scary defense if those guys are out. So I'm kind of just playing it down to the wire with those individuals.
And Greg Newsome is the best matchup in the slot of these defensive backs for Cleveland. So Cooper Kupp is playable from that standpoint, and he's bound to have a good game here. I think he was full practice today, so that bodes, I would say, a bit well for them.
And your thoughts on Kyren Williams? It's as simple as starting him, right? He's back.
Yeah, the volume's there. We had him ranked pretty high last week in his first game back, in a really soft matchup. I think Cleveland's a very good defense, but as you mentioned, they're beat up, and the running game for the Rams is really clicking when Kyren Williams is in. So yeah, absolutely start him.
Sunday Night Football. Patrick Mahomes' first time to travel to Lambeau, I believe. So let's start with the Chiefs side of the ball, because they did have, finally, and unbelievably, I never really thought they'd get there given the albatross of Marquez Valdes-Scantling's contract, but they finally made the swap, at least for one game, where Rashee Rice led the team in routes participation, 68% of routes on Mahomes dropbacks. Justin Watson, who now has the team's only end zone target since he returned from injury before the bye, as their number 2, and MVS as their 3rd wide receiver. And I believe outside of just playing a soft Raiders defense, that's what allowed that passing offense to finally get unlocked for 1 week. How are you ranking Rashee Rice, not only this week, but rest of season?
Sky Moore took a back seat to, well, he had 18 routes run. Marquez Valdez Scantling 20, Justin Watson 24, Rashee Rice 26. We had the injury to Kadarius Toney, which kind of cleared things up a bit in terms of the target tree or the route tree, number of routes these guys are getting. And Rice certainly took advantage. I had him. Hardman was also injured, right? So I have Rice ranked as a high-end wide receiver 3 this week. I still don't have complete trust. He still only ran a route on 26 of Patrick Mahomes' 38 dropbacks. I would like to see that number higher. But I think certainly of this group outside of Travis Kelce, he's the best bet. And then after that, I think Watson has been clearly the most productive of the other Chiefs receivers. And this is not a particularly good matchup against the Packers. They're, worse against the run than they are against the pass. They did pretty well last week against a very, high octane Lions offense. I don't know if they're gonna be able to play out of their minds again like that, but I certainly think Rice is worth a start. And if you're in a deep league, Justin Watson is as well.
And I would like also to see Rice get more, but we're not going to. Like that 70% was also the cap for MVS. The point is that he is Patrick Mahomes' number 1 wide receiver now, at least based on 1 game. And so that's why I was asked in my chats earlier this week, like this guy or this guy rest of the season, yada, yada, yada. And like I have Rice over Christian Watson, Brandon Cooks, all those fringe guys off waiver wires, Jaden Reed. I have Rice over all of them rest of season because if we're getting Patrick Mahomes number 1 against the softest schedule imaginable, like I definitely want to be ahead of that because then he's a weekly wide receiver too.
I mean, yeah, you could say he's his number 1 receiver, but really that's Travis Kelce. So you got to look at Rice within that context. But yeah, it's just been it's been a grind since. Well, you're saying now you're saying Rice over Kelce. It's been a grind here since Tyreek Hill left. We've been looking for who's going to be the next guy, and it's clearly rest of season. I would put my money on Rice, but again, he's not running the routes that Tyreek Hill did. Clearly. So that's just the one thing. The ceiling's only going to be so high when you're running 3/4 of the routes or 2/3 of the routes.
For the other side of the ball, the Packers took care of business against the Lions, and Jordan Love, I knew it was going to happen, Paulson. I knew I was going to wake up and see the ESPN talk shows, and they were going to say Jordan Love is improving, and that's perhaps the case. But we also know with our jobs that he's had the softest schedule possible over the last month. And of course, he got there against the Chargers and the Lions defenses in back-to-back weeks. Even being at home, I'm really worried in this spot about the Packers offense. I have confidence in Christian Watson since we did see without Dontavian Wicks, who may or may not play this week on Thanksgiving, Christian Watson a season-high 91% route participation, which led to a season-high target share. Jaden Reed has also been popping the past few games. But I still personally worry about the Packers offense in this spot.
Yeah, I don't think they're out of the woods yet in terms of, their ugly offense from earlier in the season could certainly rear its ugly head. I feel like they turned a corner a little bit with their scheming, but there's just a better called game last few weeks as well. But the Chiefs have a very tough defense. We know that. They're good in all facets. Jacoby Myers last week, 6 for 79 and a touchdown. Devontae Adams, 5 for 73 and no touchdowns. Both had 7 targets. Aiden O'Connell had 248 yards passing and a touchdown. So the Chiefs struggled for their standards, struggled against the Vegas passing attack, which was surprising. And they also gave up 110 yards rushing to Josh Jacobs. So I don't know if the Packers are able to use this template and figure out how to move the ball on the Chiefs, or if maybe the Chiefs are struggling a little bit relative to what they did previous this season. I'm not super optimistic about the the Packer offense in terms of scoring a ton of points, but they might be in a position if the Chiefs put up a ton to play catch up. And Jordan Love has been pretty good at home. And I do want to ask you though, is he now an NFL caliber quarterback in your eyes, or is he still, XFL?
This is the litmus test. This is the test right here.
This game. What do you need from him? What do you need from him in this game to say that he is an NFL caliber quarterback?
I need him to not play the Rams, Steelers, Chargers, and Lions the last month.
like, what do you need though? Do you need a win? Do you need 250 and a touchdown? What do you want from Jordan Love this week
So
to
what's
say
happened is
he
that
is?
in the first half, he's been completely broken in games. Literally, Josh Allen is the only quarterback who's been Kenny Pickett was the only quarterback who's been worse in EPA per play in the first half. And then since Jordan Love is the one who, like Derek Carr and other quarterbacks, creates his own problems and then like digs himself a hole in the offense, then Jordan Love, the only quarterback who's been better in terms of EPA per play in the second half in the league, is Josh Allen. So I don't know. It's just one of those situations where like, kind of like what's happening with Jared Goff now too, the past 2 games. Jared Goff has 3 picks and 3 fumbles the last 2 weeks. And so he's getting there in fantasy only because of the problems he creates. Jordan Love is creating these problems for himself to get there. So I don't know.
Well,
I guess
not the last few games though.
Well, because the softest match is possible. Yeah,
Okay,
that's why we look at schedules.
You got to answer my question. What stat line or what result do you need from Jordan Love this week to say that he's an NFL caliber quarterback?
Well, honestly, like given quarterback play this year, sure. I mean, I'm an NFL quarterback this year, so I will say Jordan Love is officially an NFL quarterback because I'm forced to watch Jake Browning and PJ Walker and Joe Flacco and Derek Carr and just keep on going down the list of guys. So sure.
All right. Well, I'm going to take the win. I'm going to take the win on that. You're no longer categorizing him as an XFL caliber quarterback. No, so I'm
because I've seen other quarterbacks this year, and you're right. Jordan Love is top 15, I guess, among this bunch of guys. And finally, oh, and by the way, Aaron Jones, we don't think we're going to get him this week, right?
Right. Yeah. But definitely waiting and seeing on him. I know they said that it was not a significant knee injury, but you want him, especially with what happened earlier this year, you want to see a full practice out of him before you really trust him in your lineup again.
Speaking of XFL quarterbacks, Jake Browning is headed to Jacksonville as the Jaguars are 2-score favorites, unsurprisingly. Bengals defense, probably the worst in the league, worse than the Cardinals as well. So it's just a spot. We think everyone gets there. I am somewhat worried about Travis Etienne. I know we're starting him as long as he's out there. Hasn't practiced as of Thursday, got banged up last week. And then Dearness Johnson also coming on strong, at least 7 touches in back-to-back games, at least 30-plus receiving yards in 3 consecutive games as well. And Doug Peterson has continued before the bye, emphasizing that they want to limit Etienne's workload just to keep him healthy for the stretch run, since they now have 8 wins and the tiebreaker over the Texans. So I bet if you're in like a tough spot in 12-team leagues, I bet we get a lot more Dearness Johnson than people think in this one.
Yeah, I tweeted out last week that I've added Dearness Johnson in a couple of leagues, and now that Etienne is banged up and has his chest injury, it also could be I don't know if the Jaguars are going to run away with this one, but you could see Dearness Johnson with a lot of touches in the second half if the Jaguars have a very good first half. So I think he is a sneaky start from that standpoint in a soft matchup with the RB1 kind of banged up. And then on the other side of the ball, I wanted to ask you about Jake Browning. Like, I know he had I looked at his PFF stats and he had a high number of turnover-worthy plays. I didn't watch this particular game, but 227 yards, 8.7 yards per attempt. I like the yards per attempt as a measure of like how good of a game a player had. 1 touchdown, 1 interception. He did run 3 times only for 9 yards. The defense is the Bengals defense is terrible, probably going to give up a lot of points to the Jaguars offense, which has gotten a lot better over the last couple of weeks. Could you see Jake Browning as a decent streamer this week, given he's got pretty good weapons, a soft defense, and can run the ball a little bit?
It probably works both ways. Yes. I do think since it looks like we may have T. Higgins and Jamar Chase out there for him, I think it'll help. Although I still don't think T. Higgins is startable. I think it'll help since the Jaguars are a pass funnel. Right. And what are they? 29th in our schedule adjusted tool? 29th or 26th? I just
for
looked.
Quarterbacks. For quarterbacks, 24th.
24th.
But against receivers, 28th. They're the absolute pass funnel, and just everything lines up here for a bad quarterback who's had a decent outing against a pretty good Steelers defense to have a pretty good game. And we have 6 teams on bye, and you got Derek Carr without any receivers.
Yeah.
Geno Smith in a tough matchup against Dallas tonight. Do you want to start these guys over Jake Browning, who has
I'm actually really confident in Kenny Pickett. Probably
I have Pickett ahead.
Too much for my own good.
Browning. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Kenny Pickett, Gardner Minshew, I think is in a really great spot against the Titans, who we talked about are falling apart. I'm still starting them over Jake Browning, but if you need to get to Jake Browning in a 2-quarterback superflex league, I think you can. I think.
What about Baker Mayfield over Jake Browning?
Probably, but I am somewhat concerned about the injury.
Gotcha. No, I think Browning I have him at 18. I feel like I'm really high on him, but
that's pretty high.
If you look at this week,
yeah,
it's
context.
rough. Yeah.
Would I start Jake Browning or Baker Mayfield? That's a great question. I don't want to be in that position.
What about Jake Browning or Will Levis?
I would go Will Levis, but I get the argument. It's because Will Levis's problems have come under pressure, and the Colts can't get pressure at all. It's his easiest matchup since his first start. Not that he'll do anything, but it is somewhat safer.
Yeah, the Colts always, seem to be in high-scoring games as well. So you would think that maybe Tennessee's passing offense gets there as well. This is a tough week. You look at this group; it's like rough. It's rough out there. That's
where we're at. It's a really tough week, but I think we answered everything we need to help everyone get by and their 16
If you can bench Joe Mixon, It's rough. He's got.
I don't think anyone even realized he handled 100% of the running back touches last week because it just doesn't matter.
They couldn't run the ball. No, they got the Jaguars, who are 8th in that metric. He is going to see all the touches. You could say that.
Yeah, that's literally the only argument. And then again, what does he do with them? Who knows? But
who knows?
The Jaguars are also, again, a pass funnel, so he's not creating room in this game. It's ugly. All right, Paulson, what else will you have for everyone back to a normal schedule this week on the site?
Yeah, Sneaky Starts is up already. Take a look at that. And I'll be doing a Discord chat here in a couple hours for 444 subscribers. If you are a 444 subscriber and haven't gotten into Discord yet, please do. There's a great community of fellow subscribers that will help answer questions. We also get the analysts in there for AMAs. I know, John, you do AMAs in there and chats with TJ on Sunday morning. So it's a great resource for everybody. We'll get everybody involved in the Discord if we can.
I also jump in whenever I get pinged in a chat. I'll answer your start sit questions Sunday morning. I just don't like doing it early in the week because, there's no need for it. Let's wait for injury reports. Let's see how these things shake out. And then I can give you the best answer possible. And as you mentioned, DFS show back to normal as well. 6 p.m. Eastern on Friday on the 444 YouTube channel. So until then, good luck out there because I know we're all steaming towards the fantasy playoffs. And remember, be a little bit kinder than what's required. We'll see you then.